Today we start with a marvelous opportunity we will give you to listen to Nobel laureates that we have drawn together. And it has been under the management, if you want to say, the guidance of Danielle Paulson, who has worked hard with the logistics. So I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to introduce our Nobelist, and we congratulate you for doing this and thank our panel. I have to mention that Professor Wolfgang Ketterle is on our board of trustees and our Nobel in physics. With that, Danielle, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I would like to first begin by thanking everyone for coming to this morning's Nobel Laureate panel, which is opening a series of very exciting events planned for today as part of CEE's 40th anniversary celebration. My name is Danielle Paulson, and I'm a junior at Harvard College. I attended RSI in the summer of 2020 and loved it, and I'm very excited to be part of this weekend's festivities by moderating this panel. I'm very humbled to be in the company of 3 Nobel laureates who are world leaders in their respective fields. Dr. Abhijit Banerjee is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at MIT and a founder and director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL. Over the last 20 years, JPAL researchers have worked in 80 countries across the world, generating evidence on what works in fighting poverty and what does not. Dr. Banerjee was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019 for helping develop an innovative experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. Dr. William G. Kaelin Jr. is the Sidney Farber Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Senior Physician in Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Dr. Kaelin was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2019 for his discovery of how cells sense and adapt to oxygen availability. Finally, Dr. Wolfgang Ketterle is the John D. MacArthur Professor of Physics at MIT and director of the MIT-Harvard Center for Ultracold Atoms. Dr. Ketterle was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2001 for his observation of Bose-Einstein condensation in a gas in 1995. Thank you so much to each of you for so generously sharing your time with us this morning. I'll now start with some prepared questions, and then I'll try to leave around 15 minutes at the end for the audience to ask some questions as well. So I think we can begin by talking about how you developed your academic interests. So how did you discover your passion for your respective fields as you went along your academic journeys? Did you always know that atomic physics or cancer treatment or development economics is where you were meant to be? I think we can go in any order, whoever wants to speak first.
Okay. Hi, good morning. So I think I knew at an early age I wanted to work on cancer. I was surprised I eventually became a cancer scientist, but I did think I wanted to work on cancer. I remember when I was 10 or 11 years old, I went to the wake for the mother of one of my elementary school classmates who had died of breast cancer, and there was just something so intriguing and sinister about the idea that one of your own cells could go rogue and actually attack you and kill you. And then when I trained in internal medicine and medical oncology, I found cancer medicine fascinating, all the different ways that cancer could present, and I like systemic diseases to think about. They were the more complex puzzles to solve rather than, for example, just focusing on a particular organ for the rest of my life. So I really thought I was going to go into cancer medicine, and I came to the Dana-Farber in 1987 to complete my training in cancer medicine, again, thinking I was going to be a clinical doctor. But I had heard the early rumblings of how molecular biology were starting to change the way we could study a disease, including a disease such as cancer. And then I had the very good fortune to train with David Livingston, and he's really the one who trained me to be a scientist at the bench, and maybe we'll come back to that in the context of mentorship later.
Well, I would say in my case it was somewhat different. As a child and high school student, I like to, play with things, construct things. I was the person at home, if something was not working, I just took it apart and wanted to figure out. And so when I was maybe 12 or so, I repaired things at home which my parents couldn't repair. So I was sort of a tinkerer. At the same time, I loved mathematics. I loved difficult problems in mathematics. And I had an excellent mathematics teacher who made sure that I didn't get bored by sometimes giving me very special problems to think about it and to solve. But, it was clear, I wanted to combine, tinkering, maybe some experimental approach and maybe mathematical things, but you can do that in mathematics, you can do that in computer science, you can do that in engineering, and you can do that in physics. So when I went to the university, I said, physics is a little bit of everything, which is right and wrong, but I got started in physics, and the more I learned in physics, I really got hooked and continued in physics. But maybe if there's another question, I don't want to talk too much about it now, but physics is, of course, has many areas. You can do physics in industry, you can do physics as an academic researcher, you can do theoretical physics, you can do experimental physics, and in this wider area of physics, applied versus fundamental, I really changed my course multiple times. I did theoretical work for a year, I did experimental work, I worked in very applied physics, and maybe that's a message I want to give at this point, that I really had to figure out who I was, where my talents were, and where my interests are. When I did theoretical physics, I thought, that's it for me. But after a year, I realized, yep, but something is missing. It's too abstract or something. So I really had to literally go full circle, or maybe 2 full circles, until I had figured out where my strengths and my interests are, which would sustain me. And it actually took me until I came to MIT, and at that point, I was 32, 33 years old, and I found what I wanted to do and 5 years later, I changed my field. I came to MIT, started in a new field, and 5 years later, I made the discovery which led to the Nobel Prize. So I really had to find where I think I was best at. But it took me until 32.
I've maybe a more extreme version of that same story. I really didn't. I think I must have been in my mid-20s before I even wanted to. I was doing a Ph.D. at Harvard, and I still didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And in many ways, I still don't. But it was, and in many ways, it was a set of, I think, misapprehensions about the things that I was going to like that drove me there. So I started out as a math student. I realized that though I was good at math, it was completely mind-sapping for me. I didn't find anything interesting about it. I was very good at it, but not particularly interested. So that
Careful, Danielle is a math major.
I'm not. There are people. I knew many math majors because I was studying math, and they were often were brilliant people who had a passion I didn't have, and so I discovered So I started doing economics largely because in the Indian very rigid system, if you commit to doing something and you get in, and you're just supposed to do that. So when you quit sort of halfway, then it's hard to get into something. Economics happened to be available, so I went in. So okay, that was okay. It was interesting, but I had no particular reason, except the only reason I ended up at Harvard, I would say, is because I was a pretty good student, and I was perhaps so bored with everything else that I could do that I actually decided that maybe I'll discover something if I go on to the PhD. And maybe that's the one useful lesson that I want to offer, which is that I think it's useful to have high standards, to not be satisfied. I think that's what Dr. Ketterle just said, that you have to be dissatisfied with yourself. And I think I was dissatisfied. Then I did my PhD. I was a theoretical economist. I taught theoretical economics at Princeton, at Harvard, at MIT. And again, I was just bored with it. And then I started thinking about doing experiments, and somehow that was liberating. And now I feel like a little bit like I've gone back to doing theory again, because I was starting to feel that I was, it was too easy to do the experiments I was doing. So I think being bored is a very powerful driver, and one that I recommend.
So now I'm going to out myself. So I told you I had a long-standing interest in cancer, which was true. But in the 60s and 70s, when I was growing up, I took as little biology as possible, because biology was so boring and descriptive. It was like stamp collecting. So still is. So I'm the fourth math major. So I majored in mathematics and computer science. But one of the things I got right, and I certainly got a lot of things wrong, was, for me, mathematics was a great discipline to teach you how to think clearly and logically. And if that's your foundation, you can do anything. So I got that right. And secondly, I love the word tinker, because again, back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the toys you had actually forced you to tinker, even if you didn't know you were tinkering, and you had a lot of free time to entertain yourself. And I think that's another theme that probably runs through us.
Thank you. What would you say was the most instrumental to your development from a young scientist to a pioneer in your field today?
Without any question, to find mentors who inspire you, to have people who challenge you. And for me, a life-changing moment was when I had a PhD, I had worked for 2 postdoctoral advisors. They were all excellent. But when I came to MIT, I found a mentor who truly challenged me, Professor Dave Pritchard. He really showed me how much more I could learn. He was not kind of saying, yeah, it's good what you can. He always showed me that there was a pathway to become a better scientist, to think more deeply, to maybe be sometimes more honest, to say, hey, what we are doing is not super interesting, but it keeps us going, to really distinguish between the small fish to catch, which we sometimes have to do because we are hungry. But we should always hunt for the big fish and just catch the small fish on the way. We should never go for a fishing expedition with the goal of catching many, many small fish. So a lot of those things I really learned from this person. And I think without this person, my career would have been very, very different. So fortunately, you go to several stages in your career, maybe in an undergraduate thesis, some graduate work or postdoctoral work. So you have multiple opportunities to meet the person who is a real match for you. I mean, this mentor was very demanding, and I know some other people were unhappy with him because he could also be a little bit rough, but that was just perfect for me. So in other words, it's not that one mentor is good for everybody, but it is important that you find somebody in a certain way you are clicking with. So if you look for a job or look for postdoctoral appointment or something, and you have a gut feeling that there is something special if you would work for this person, that's a good sign.
I can once again echo that thought. I ended up where I ended up, perhaps more indirect route. But I think one piece of it was my PhD advisor was Eric Maskin, who also was a Nobel laureate, professor at Harvard, and Eric was. Well, he was frightening. It is extremely sweet, genuinely one of the sweetest people I know, and one of the kindest. But his threshold for being bored with anything you're explaining, it was extremely low. So almost anything you had to say, he found maybe mildly interesting, but not enough to actually react to. So I spent my PhD years trying to bait him, to see if I could say something that would actually get him interested. And that's a good training, because you learn to tell stories. You learn to say why what you're saying is interesting. It's not just what you're doing, but the narrative around it. And I learned to sort of find a way to go get through his defenses, to get him to say, okay, yeah, well, maybe I didn't expect that. And when you hear that, you go home and you just think about the fact that he said that for days and days and days. And I think in that sense, I think what I got from that him was most importantly that sense that you really need to justify what you're doing in terms of something that's you can explain to anybody. It has to be really important in some, not in some small fish sense, but in some big fish sense. I think the other thing that I think was critical in my particular life was that I think economics is both obviously something that you want to apply in your life, and the economics I was taught was almost entirely useless for the life that I came from. I grew up next to a slum in Calcutta, and there was just nothing there that matched the stories that where I was being taught. So it was very much that dissatisfaction, and that dissatisfaction took me. It was very. I was very inadequate to that task for a very long time. I couldn't see the route there. I was producing papers, publishing, getting jobs, etc. I was not that, but I was really dissatisfied. I couldn't articulate to myself what was it that how to make that link between the poverty and frustration that I saw around me and the economics that I was teaching, writing about, publishing about. And I think that making that connection eventually it's still something that I haven't fully satisfactorily done, but at least that frustration was a key driver for my own efforts to just let me move. I'm doing fine, but I don't like what I'm doing. And I think that dissatisfaction really did help me a lot.
So I promise we did not rehearse and compare notes ahead of time, but maybe to give you a slightly different spin on it. So I had 3 laboratory mentors before I started my own laboratory. The first was in college. I worked in a chemistry lab. I can tell you in hindsight, the project I was given was uninteresting, unimportant, and undoable, which is a perfect storm. And then on the last day of the laboratory, I was in the laboratory, I correctly said that this project would never be brought to completion because it was almost certainly based on a mistake or an artifact by one of my predecessors. So my professor rewarded me with a C-, which for a pre-medical student is like having a wooden stake driven through your heart. And then he wrote in the margin of my Duke transcript, "Mr. Kaelin appears to be a bright young man whose future lies outside the laboratory," which is like being told you have a good face for radio. So then, and then in medical school, I was given a project that was okay, but it was never going to set the world on fire. And I had a functional lab and a functional mentor, but it wasn't inspirational. And thankfully, my third mentor and lab experience was at the Dana-Farber with the great David Livingston. And now for the first time, I had a brilliant mentor who inspired me. I had a project that the whole world cared about, and he gave me the tools, both intellectually and technically, to succeed. So mentorship is key. And I tell you that story in part because I know what it was like to be floundering in a laboratory. And when you're a young person, if you're floundering in a laboratory, your first inclination is going to say, it's my fault. I'm not good enough to do this. And maybe on occasion that's true, but I think more often than not, you simply have to find another mentor in another laboratory. I guess one other thing I'll just pick up on, there are lots of styles of mentorship, and I completely agree. It's about finding the person who is sort of your mentor. And so, for example, I think you mentioned your mentor was sort of frightening. Somehow David Livingston did it all for me without ever frightening me. He inspired me, he elevated me, he believed in me at times in ways I don't think I believed in myself. But he never frightened me, he never belittled me. It was really quite remarkable. So part of it is also finding the mentorship style, and it's not one size fits all. So just find that mentor who inspires you. And I'll end with one last secret. I think there are many wonderful things about training at a place like at Harvard or like an MIT, But I think one of the many things you get out of it is you leave with a little bit more audacity because you've been surrounded by great people. Hopefully you have been inspired, and you think, why not me? Why shouldn't I be the person to take on this next big question or the big fish, as was mentioned? Bob Weinberg, who lives and works nearby here, says, it's as hard to work on an uninteresting problem as it is to work on an interesting problem, the clear implication being pick interesting problems.
Thank you so much. So I think now we can go on to discussing the work that ultimately led to each of you receiving a Nobel Prize. So we can start with, what was the path that each of you took to receive the Nobel?
So when I started working in David Livingston's lab, he was working on a gene that, when altered, and can cause certain cancers. And in particular, this gene is sometimes inherited from mom or dad in defective form. And that was very important for me because it's very easy, getting back to biology being descriptive, to start studying phenomenon and measuring lots of things. But in some cases, and in fact many cases, you don't know whether what you're studying is causative or merely correlative. And if you want to get to the heart of the matter, you want to be working on something that's causative. And getting back to my mathematical training, if A, then B. And genetics is the premier tool for establishing that you're studying something that's causal. I mean, it was very clear that mutations in this gene cause these cancers. And then the puzzle was, well, why? And what's biochemically the why? And so when I started my own laboratory, I knew from my clinical training about families that have what we call von Hippel-Lindau disease. And this is a disease that was described over 100 years ago. And these individuals likewise have a defective gene going from generation to generation, causing cancer in midlife. And I knew from my clinical training that the tumors that these patients develop were notorious for producing the distress signals, the molecular distress signals that you or I would start producing if we went to the top of Mount Everest and weren't getting enough oxygen. So my hunch, and it turned out to be correct, was if we could understand biochemically what the protein does, made with the instructions of this gene. So, not to get too technical, but I think this audience knows that genes are really blueprints for proteins. If we could understand biochemically what this protein did, we would understand how cells sensed and responded to changes in oxygen, in addition to learning, the nuts and bolts of how certain cancers form in the first place. So that was really the path, was to study these families, these rare families, and to understand why defects in this particular gene cause these particular tumors.
Well, in my case, I said I switched my field and started in atomic physics in 1990, and 5 years later I made the big discovery. Well, when I decided to change my fields in my early 30s, I was looking for the most fundamental and the most dynamic and exciting field of physics, which somewhat overlapped with my knowledge in optics and molecules. And this was the field of ultracold atoms. But when I joined the field, I thought the big discoveries of how to get to extremely low temperature had been made. And indeed, the people in this field who developed the techniques to work with cold atoms in the late 80s, they got the Nobel Prize in 1997. So that was really big. So when I joined the field, I thought it's a field which is now super interesting thanks to those discoveries, and I could do research at an exciting level, and this was the best I could plan for. I had no idea that 5 years later, the field would jump up even more and would create many, many new excitement opportunities for research thanks to the discovery I was part of. So I had no idea that this was in the making. I did not know that this field was ripe and ready for a new and maybe even bigger discovery. But when I joined the field, there was sort of the idea, but what would happen if we would go to the absolute coldest temperature, down to absolute zero? And there was the idea of a new form of matter predicted already by Einstein 70 years before, and nobody had seen it. But everybody said, this is impossible. People have tried it, people failed. And I, as a young person, said, why? Isn't it possible? My excellent mentor told me, no, it can't work, but he knew a lot, and I said, but you have numbers here, you have numbers about behavior of atoms. If I insert them in equations and do calculation, it doesn't sound impossible. And he gave me more and more advice. So in other words, I had the right person to answer my question. Also, he was pessimistic, I was optimistic, and eventually I became somewhat obsessed with the idea, and ultimately, back and forth between him and me, we found a method to do one step into the direction. And that eventually opened up a pathway, and only a few years later, I co-discovered Bose-Einstein condensation. So maybe let me summarize. The question which I solved was there. I didn't make it, I didn't think, okay, what is the Nobel-worthy discovery? I joined the field, but I tried to understand what was done in the field by myself. I read all the old papers and questioned that what people said was impossible, there should be a pathway. I came up with a combination of new ideas, and that eventually led to the big step forward.
So to prove that we didn't rehearse this, I'm going to tell almost the opposite story. So I entered the field that I now teach, sort of because at Harvard, I was teaching at Princeton as an assistant professor. At Harvard, they decided that, okay, look, he's doing well, let's hire him. So they hired me, but they had no idea what they would let me teach. There were plenty of people teaching theory, and they were great people, including Eric Maskin, but many others. And so there was no space for me. So they asked me what to teach. And I said, well, I'll teach development economics. And I said that, I don't know how I was allowed to get away with it, because I had never taken a class in this field. So it was a act of, it seemed interesting, seemed like we should know something about it. When I was a student, I tried to go to a class. In fact, I attended one lecture. It was so boring that I left. So I decided that I was not going to be able to, but what was really important for me, and it was a field that was clearly, had a very high period into the late 70s or mid 70s, and then was a bit in the doldrums for a while. And so there was not much competition for teaching it. So in some ways it's not useless to be in a place where, people think this is a dead field, nothing's going to happen. Because then if you manage to do something, it's even if it's small, it looks big. So I think I was lucky to be placed in this position of someone who was essentially handed. The next year I came to MIT. Again, MIT had a set of distinguished development economists, but who were then, more the age I am now. So they had been then done their important research in the 50s and early 60s. And so they were, again, very kind and let me do what I wanted with the field. There was just not much pressure to sort of fall in line with any program. And as a result, I had the opportunity, I think, to really redesign how the field is taught, not just at MIT, but everywhere. I was just at the right place at the right time. And therefore, I could hit a lot of questions that seemed interesting to answer, but I couldn't figure out how, and people hadn't quite got there. So, and I was very lucky that Michael Kremer, who was also awarded the Nobel Prize with me, was a junior colleague of mine at MIT, and so we would talk all the time. And he came up with this idea that maybe we should just give up on trying to do empirical research by taking existing data sets and instead do our own experiments, collect our own data. I'd been collecting my own data for some years then, so I had the experience to pull that off. And so Michael and I did one experiment in India, and then I got hooked on this idea that, well, it's actually much easier to do experiments than we thought. People hadn't done them. The view was very much that it's impossible to do experiments in field like economics. In fact, it turned out that now with the third person who won the Nobel Prize with Michael and me was Esther Duflo. She and I set up the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, which is right across the street, in 2003, 20 years ago. And the idea was to promote, that everybody should and can do experiments. And it turned out that that's true. We have now about 1,800 experiments that the network we created, which is about 800 professors across the world, has done 1,800 experiments in 80 countries. So I think I would say a lot of the credit goes to the whole world that started playing the game we set up. We were just lucky to set up a game that everybody else wanted to join, that 800 professors wanted to join this effort to generate evidence that you can use to deal with real-life problems. And I think we got a lot more credit than we should have, because in some ways we were just happened to be at the right place at the right time. So the whole story is I was really, development economics was available. I was in the right place to take it and sort of give it a shape. And then experiments were available, and I was there to be at the beginning of that. And I think I got a lot of credit for that.
So the Nobel Committee said that Dr. Banerjee's prize was awarded for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty, Dr. Kaelin's prize for their discovery of how cells sense and adapt to oxygen availability, and Dr. Ketterle's prize for the achievement of Bose-Einstein condensation in dilute gases of alkali atoms. Could each of you explain your respective discoveries in some more detail? What was most exciting about the research that went into your discoveries, and what the implications of those discoveries are?
Maybe now I want to demonstrate that, even Nobel laureates can, keep it short. I can explain to you with a single sentence what I got the Nobel Prize for. And the short message is, I did for atoms what the laser is for light. You know the difference between laser light and ordinary light. And if you don't know it, you shouldn't be in this room. But there's an analogy. No, you know what a laser is. I mean, you use laser pointers and other things. So no, you can't. You're not so ignorant. But what I say is, but there is an analogy. Atoms can be in random motion, or atoms can have the coherence, the unidirectionality, the uniformity of laser light. And I was able to go to very low temperature and find a form of matter where the atoms behaved like laser light. One sentence, this is what I did. And for the people who know more, to behave like laser light is related to superfluidity and superconductivity. So we found a new form of superfluidity.
So, without getting overly technical, we and my fellow laureates figured out in great biochemical detail the molecular circuit that allows you to sense and respond to changes in oxygen. And again, without getting into the technical detail, when we saw this circuit, when we saw the steps at atomic resolution, it was so beautiful and elegant and unexpectedly simple that your jaw dropped. In fact, sometimes people say, did we think we might win the Nobel Prize? The truth is, when we saw the answer, we knew it was the kind of discovery that leads to Nobel Prizes. But I tell you that, and especially for the students, because first of all, that's a tribute to nature. That wasn't a tribute to us. We had the privilege of seeing this mechanism first, and that's the real joy of science. So live for that. Don't live for prizes. People who live for prizes statistically wind up being pretty unhappy. So it was the privilege and the joy of seeing that discovery. But had the correct answer struck people as clunky or a variation of things that had been seen before, there would have been no discussion of prizes. The other thing we had going in our favor was once we saw the circuit, there were multiple opportunities to intervene pharmacologically to make the circuit more active or less active. So for example, now there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the world that have their anemia treated by taking a pill that activates the circuit and tricks the body into thinking it's not getting enough oxygen And so as a result, the body starts making its own red blood cells. Conversely, where we know cancers have hijacked this system so they can get their own oxygen, we now have new drugs that block the ability of the tumor to get that oxygen in the form of a blood supply. So it was sort of a perfect storm that the answer struck people as elegant, and it had lots of practical implications.
So I think I feel listening to both of my co-laureates that they are. This sounds much more somehow more brilliant than what I'm going to tell you. So the idea that to know causal effects of interventions, you have to do an experiment at some level is very easy to understand. It's sort of it's less obvious than one might think. I eventually I was dissatisfied with the answer, and eventually I started working on the question. But it is something that's very common in all experimental science, that you say, okay, we're going to essentially randomly assign a treatment to some people, and the others will be control, and we'll compare them. And I think that idea, the question is, how do you apply that idea to a real-world program? And it takes a set of steps, because if you think about, a program that, let's say, and I speak not this precisely because in some ways our prize was for a method rather than for a particular discovery. The challenge of the method is that, so if you think about, we're going to make it easier for people to claim a particular government program, okay? So those things happen. It's not that, some people will not be eligible for that program. Others will be already have it. Then there are some people who are eligible who are not getting it, okay? So how do you facilitate that process? If you ask that, that's a sort of first-order question for most social programs, is how do you get it to the right people? Problem is that happens at a scale where, a scale of hundreds of millions of people. So how do you design an experiment where your population is, let's say 10 million people? Out of that, maybe 1 million are eligible for the program, out of which 50,000 are at the margin of where they should have got it, but they don't, or they shouldn't have got it and are getting it. And those 50,000 are not actually 50,000, probably 400,000 are like that, unfortunately. But those people is what you're working with out of 10 million. How do you do an experiment where you target the experiment to the right population? So the problem is not, so whereas in a lab, when you're doing an experiment, we do lab experiments in economics as well, but you can say, okay, you are getting this pill and you are not. And you don't really have so much of a choice. Or if it's something, even if it's not, obviously if it's not animate, then you just decide which of the test tubes are going to get the reagent or something. So you have much more control over the process of experimentation. The real challenge of doing experiments in the social sciences is that you don't have much control. The world is out there. You can only say, we are going to randomly change the rules of assigning a particular government program to this, from these rules to those rules, but those rules will not be, they will be applied by human beings on the ground. They will decide to apply them in their own, under their own judgment, under their own incentives, and then other people who receive it will either respond to those changes or not. So the chain of action is very long. And you have to design experiments taking into account the fact that the chain of action is very long. So this is an example of how a Nobel Prize winner can give an answer, a very long answer.
So before we move on to Q&A, I think we'll do one more question. Centered around your current work and your perspective on your fields today. So could you each discuss some of the highlights of the research you've done since being awarded the Nobel Prize? This could be both research related to the work that led you to receive the Nobel or completely new projects as well.
Well, when I said I changed my field multiple times before I found the field, and how important it was to get also the experience and the self-confidence, but also the frustration of having worked on something, I'm sometimes now embarrassed after that to admit that I've stayed in the same field now for more than 20 years. But my excuse is that the field has changed dramatically. So it was, I'm not getting bored by being in the same field because the field is completely different of what it was. But the common denominator is we wanted to discover a new form of matter and went to very low temperature. But the very low temperature is now the method where we can address many, many, many other questions in this new regime of temperature. So we are now looking not at Bose-Einstein condensates and superfluidity, we are looking at magnetism, we are looking at conduction, we are looking at other quantum phenomena at low temperature. And therefore I've stayed in the field of low temperature, but I've now switched my attention to a variety of other quantum phenomena, some of which are also related to quantum technologies and quantum computation now.
I guess for me, in a sense, it's a long path back to where when I was in my thesis, I worked on things like rumors, the theory of how this is in the 80s, so before anybody, the word social media had been coined. So we were, but people still gossiped, and they still had. Spread rumors, and they still, made inferences from very unreliable messages. And so one of the things that I've gone back to both since in the last couple of years, thinking about these issues, is now that we have a world which is seemed almost, riven by social media. How do you study experimentally and theoretically the effects of things like social media? And so the study of social networks and information flows in the social networks has sort of become very central to my work. And during the pandemic, one of the things we were trying to wrestling with is how do you get a message across to people about, for example, we did an enormous experiment, many million people during Thanksgiving and Christmas in the US, trying to get people the message, don't go visit your grandparents. This is a time when maybe staying home might be smarter. So that's a message that was politically quite delicate. And the question was, how do you get it past people's defenses? People were getting social messages, something like 12 social messages a day of some kind or the other. So how do you get a message, design messages so that they go past that obvious barrier that, I've heard everything, I don't want to hear it. And so that's a kind of question we were working on. And fortunately, we managed to actually nudge off, maybe enough people that we can pick up the changes in COVID infection rates at the county level data in the US. So during Christmas, there were less, in the counties we treated, there were less COVID infections. So people didn't travel as much, and we can see that from Google Maps data. We can see that people are traveling less. We can get that from Facebook data, because Facebook also gives you position. So we can see that they are traveling less, and COVID spreads less.
So the work we did on oxygen sensing required us to get immersed in a field that relates to how the stability or the turnover of proteins is regulated. So there's some proteins you make that exist for days, but there are other proteins you make that on occasion have to be destroyed extremely rapidly. So at the heart of the oxygen sensing mechanism, there's a step that involves the highly regulated turnover or destruction of a protein. And I tell you that because there are many targets in cancer that we know are causing the cancer, but we haven't had a path to inactivating those proteins with drugs. Typically, if a protein is inside the cell, it needs the right kind of nook or cranny for a drug to bind to that nook or cranny and inactivate the protein. So there's some really bad cancer-causing proteins out there we haven't known how to drug. So our lab and one other lab discovered that there's a new way to get rid of such bad proteins. And it relates to a clinical observation made years ago that patients with a B-cell cancer called multiple myeloma can often be induced into remission with an infamous drug called thalidomide, which some of you may remember in the room. But this was just sheer clinical serendipity that thalidomide was found to be a wonder drug for multiple myeloma. So what our lab and another lab discovered was that thalidomide acts as what's now called a molecular glue and targets this bad protein in myeloma that we didn't know how to drug for destruction. It tricks the cell into thinking that this is a protein that should go to the garbage disposal. So this has led to a new field of targeted protein degradation or drugging the undruggable with small molecule degraders. There's actually a host of biotech companies in Boston and elsewhere now that are focused on this as a new path for drugging the undruggable. But I'll close by leaving you with a David Livingston-ism. I mentioned my mentor, David Livingston. So David Livingston used to always say, a good scientist should always think the most important thing they're ever going to do lies ahead of them. And so that's very good advice. So my real answer is I hope the most important thing I'm going to do still lies ahead of me.
Great, thank you so much. So I think now we'll open up to questions from the audience. And yes, so if anyone has any questions, please.
So you each gave an example of something not to do on the path to scientific fulfillment. You talked about boredom, little fish, and a bad fit mentor. Any other wrong paths that we shouldn't take?
I'll start. The technology that's available, at least in the biomedical world today, is just awe-inspiring, what you can do now versus what you could do 20 or 30 years ago. But there's a danger there, and that is, I think some young people get attracted to the shiny technology, and they just want to do that thing. They want to be the person who knows how to use that instrument or that technology. I think that's a trap. Another David Livingston is, good experiment starts with the question. What's the question you want to answer, and then figure out the technology you need to answer the question, not the other way around. So I still think training should be about how to formulate that question and design effective experiments that allow you to answer the question and not just follow the next shiny technology that comes along.
I think we should take more questions, otherwise.
Okay.
That's a great answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
While working on your respective projects, did it cross your mind that you were going to win the Nobel Prize one day?
Yes and no. It's really true. I mean, at some point, you know that you have made a real big discovery. And yeah, people, tap on your shoulder and say, hey, you get a ticket to Stockholm soon or something, and you say, and you don't really want to hear it because everything is sort of course, vague and early. But I try to rationalize it. Maybe that's how I think as a physicist. I said, okay, this is really an exciting field, and there is probably a 50% chance that it will be recognized by Nobel. But we know that Nobel Prizes come sometimes shortly after the discovery and sometimes 20, 30 years later. And then there was the question, since often different teams have worked on something, if there would be a Nobel Prize, it would include me or it would not include me, because I made the second observation of this phenomenon. There was another group who was a couple of months ahead of me. But anyway, so I said myself, if I multiply those probabilities, maybe for the rest of my life, every year, I have a 2% chance of winning a Nobel Prize. And now the question is, ask yourself, if you think you have done something and you have a 2% chance of winning a Nobel Prize, do you have a sleepless night before the Nobel Prizes are announced or not? You're a little bit nervous, you think about it, but you say, no, it's not really happening. So that's my true answer. So I had some anticipation, but the fact that I got it early, I got it 6 years after the discovery, the phone rang, I could never expect that.
So you can tell we're all mathematicians, because I had likewise arrived at the 2%. So I thought it. So I said at 2%, I keep my ringer on at night the night before. But other than that, I don't think I'm going to win. So for me, it was likewise 2%. You know, I knew we were keeping with the fishing metaphor. I thought we were fishing in a very good place when we started working on this particular gene. But again, you have no control over whether you actually catch a pretty big fish that day. But as I said, once we saw the result, we thought it was the kind of result that put you in the 2% a year category.
So science has become increasingly systemized over the years, more bureaucracy, innovation. Do you see innovation still as something possible? It used to be maybe 40 or 50 years ago, you give someone some money, some lab, they'd go off and do stuff. Now they have to write grant proposals, get approval. Would love to hear your thoughts on whether we're still set up for innovation.
I don't think the basic things have changed. We train young people. After a few years, they get an opportunity to apply for positions, start their own lab. They get some startup money. Maybe some technology is more advanced, and setting up a state-of-the-art lab in certain field costs more money. But I think, at least in my field, that's maybe fortunate, atomic physics and some areas of condensed matter physics are tabletop experiment. It is still possible that an energetic, driven, and creative young assistant professor with a few students, a postdoc, and maybe $1 or $2 or $3 million, which is relatively modest if you see some big research budgets, they can make a discovery within a few years. That's possible. That's still possible.
I think in my field, I mean, we actually, our organization, Poverty Action Lab, does a lot of fundraising for other people to do research on, and I think we are in a better funding world than we've ever been. I mean, I want to keep my fingers crossed and knock on wood, but right now I don't think it is relative to 30 years ago a vastly better funding world.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's certainly still an opportunity for innovation, but I think for young people, the decision has to be, do I want to be what some sociologists refer to as sort of the lone hunter-gatherer scientist who just follows their instincts and curiosities and goes and tinkers and studies whatever they feel passionately about? Or at the other extreme, do you want to be a communal harvester who works in a big team? Maybe sometimes those are very technologically driven types of experiments, maybe quite costly experiments, and there's everything in between. So you just have to find what you're passionate about. For example, we're at the Broad Institute. Some of the science that gets done here is incredibly impactful and incredibly important, but I wouldn't want to do it because it's really more of an engineering type of exercise as opposed to a scientific endeavor. So I'm more of the lone hunter-gatherer, reductionist sort of scientist. But there's room for all types in the ecosystem, and they're complementary. So you just have to find what you love.
Okay, I want to ask, are you using algorithms to program people's thinking? And then as to everyone, I want to ask you if you think AI is in a position to replace the brain of human beings, even Nobel laureates, and make us, no longer necessary.
So I absolutely not. I think economics in my perhaps from where I look at it are almost ideologically committed to being libertarian. We tend to be too libertarian in my view. I think people often have extraordinarily ill-founded views about things, but it's actually hard to get our colleagues to agree to even giving people like reliable information, or how do you know they don't know it? So we're in some sense, I would say, the place where there is perhaps most resistance to the idea relative to all the other social sciences, which are much more, I think, open to the idea that people get things wrong. And so you really do need to get people to think differently. I mean, I'm actually someone who doesn't particularly, it's not my ideology, but I think it's, if you want to get published in economics, you're always fighting that battle.
So I was warned a long time ago that just because you win the Nobel Prize doesn't make you overnight an expert on, you know, world peace, saving the whales. And so I would put AI in that category. I think I know enough to be a bit skeptical about some of the claims that are being made, but it's clearly here to stay. What I'm slightly hopeful about is I work with a number of companies, including Lilly Pharmaceuticals, and what I think is happening in industry with respect to AI is what for me was a new concept, which is what they call co-piloting. Like the AI is not going to replace you, but AI will be your new co-pilot. And I've already seen examples where, you know, a clever chemist makes some potential molecules that they think will be the next drug, and the computer says, well, these are pretty good, but did you consider these? And the chemist goes, I didn't consider those, but those are brilliant. So, you know, I think co-piloting, I hope, is where we might wind up.
In my own field, I don't see the big impact of artificial intelligence. It's really, I mean, it's experimentally driven, it's conceptually driven. People really have to understand intuitively what equations mean and develop an intuition for a physical system. That's not where I think AI can help us, but AI can, for instance, help us to search, you know, the web for information, to do literature searches and such. So I think AI will be one of many useful tools, like computers, like electronics, which become more and more powerful, and they allow us to do certain parts of our research more effectively. But at this point, I am not expecting that it will change the nature of research and the approach we take to fundamental science.
I have two questions. One is the role of collaboration in, you know, when you guys started your careers compared to now, and whether collaboration has helped or hindered. And the other question is, I mean, where you guys are now is, you know, really high up there. And what were some of the challenges that you each faced? And what was the, you know, the focus and the determination for you to pursue despite those challenges? Thank you.
Maybe I'll take this since I work in the cancer field, and there's, for whatever reason, this persistent fallacy that if we just collaborated more, we'd be making progress much more rapidly. I say fallacy because scientists collaborate all the time because it's in our best interest to collaborate. But those collaborations dissolve and form based on your needs, but they're constantly forming. And so what doesn't work is putting a gun to an investigator's head and saying, you're only going to get this grant if you collaborate with doctors A, B, and C. You know, that's silly. And by the way, if that's the rule, you will be sure the grant will say, I'm going to work with doctors A, B, and C. So, you know, collaboration happens all the time because it's in your best interest, and because of the complexity of the experiments often requires you to have complementary pieces. So collaboration, I think that's taken care of. You know, in terms of challenges, I think we mentioned some of them. I mean, in a short presentation like this, it all seems kind of linear. Of course, I think all of us went down blind alleys and made mistakes and had to work our way back out of them. And I suspect that's true for all three of us.
Well, in terms of collaboration, I really want to say very clear and loud, research should be done with the smallest team possible, exclamation mark. If you put more people together, you create overhead, you don't have the agility, and it is really the wrong approach when people think research, the challenges in research are interdisciplinary. There are calls for proposals which have to, you know, have researchers from different disciplines, maybe from different continents. And I mean, this is the political agenda behind how people want research to be done. But in terms of innovation, research should always be done by the smallest team possible, and therefore we still need research funding for a single principal investigator who want to pursue an idea with just 3 or 4 students. That's really important.
I guess the smallest team possible can be quite large.
So I think we'll end on that note. Yeah. One more? Sure, one more question.
Thank you. Sorry about that. My name's Steven. I'm a current student at Stanford University. And I was wondering how, as we see the climate changing in the world and global temperatures warming, how do each of your respective fields, and how do you see each of your respective fields relating to climate science? For example, like new types of drugs or quantum computing or climate policy. How do you see your fields being impacted by and helping to solve climate change?
I would say my narrower field is not contributing at all. We are working on the insight for new materials for tomorrow, which will maybe affect technology after tomorrow. So this is really fundamental research where the insight comes. It makes other people think differently about what is possible in nature. But before this will lead to real-world application can take a really long time, and probably other people have to solve the climate change problem to make sure there is time enough for the ideas which I develop to have an impact on society and technology. But I have come up with that, I've come at peace with it, because in my previous research field in my 30s, many years ago, I was in applied research. I worked on combustion research. I tried to find methods how we can understand combustion better, and combustion is deeply related to energy and climate change. I left the field to do what I'm doing right now because I felt it was a better match for me. In our society, we need people who solve the urgent problems of today, but we should also allow a small fraction of the researchers to just look on the most fundamental and far out questions. We need both with the right balance. And what the right balance is, maybe that's a decision which hopefully some funding agency and political leaders make in the right way.
I guess one of the frustrations of a lot of, I think, sort of climate technologies is that you come up with a great technology, then people don't use them, or they don't use them the right way. We have actually a very large program in part of our Poverty Action Lab. We have, so it's called the King Climate Initiative, and what we do is see if there are available technologies and why they're not being used. So there's a lot of experiments on that.
So our work doesn't directly impact on climate change, but one of the few things I have tried to do with my Nobel Prize is try to be an advocate for the importance of the scientific method and scientifically based decision making, because in the end, as I think most of us know, the climate change problem is largely a political problem. There's certainly room for scientific innovation that will help us solve the problem, but in the end, this demands political solutions, and that demands electing people who will make decisions based on science and not on whims and expediency. So that's...
Great, thank you so much. I think we'll end here.
Thank you.